Hello everyone, and welcome back to Cine 104, History of Motion Pictures, 1945 to present. This is class 9 of 15, I think it is. I'm Professor Dave Echols, and we are working our way through the 70s and into the 1980s, and we're going to talk about a new way of doing business thanks to movies like Heaven's Gate and Jaws, and we're also going to move into Vietnam War films that were all done a few years after the war was over with Full Metal Jacket and Apocalypse Now. So let's dive in. Starting off with Heaven's Gate from 1980, director Michael Cimino, and he was really riding high by this point. A couple of years previously, he had won the Best Picture and the Best Director and Screenplay and Cinematography and all sorts of wonderful awards for The Deer Hunter. And the studio basically said, "You are a genius. Here is a truckload of money. Go out and make more art." And too many directors of this era were being told the same thing. A lot of them were very young. And young people, I hate to say, but I've been there too, are not very good with instant fame. I haven't been there for instant fame, but I can predict that if I suddenly had millions of dollars in the bank, I probably would have been just as irresponsible as these guys were. Maybe not quite, because these guys were pretty out there. Anyway, Heaven's Gate is a Western, and Westerns weren't really big at this time in American history, film history. At the end of the 1970s, we'd been seeing all sorts of other cutting-edge type films like The Graduate in 2001 and things like that, and here comes this kind of out-of-the-past Western. It was based on a real series of events, the Johnson County War, that took place in Wyoming somewhere around 1877, I think it was, something like that. And that was going to be Michael Cimino's next work of art. And so he packed up his crew, a rather large crew, and they went to, they weren't in Wyoming, I think they were in Montana, somewhere pretty far away anyway, pretty far away from Hollywood. And so it was hard for the studio and their producers to check in on Cimino, and he really wanted this to be a wonderful movie. He really worked really hard, and he wanted to shoot as much of the movie as he could at a particular time of day, which is known as magic hour. Magic hour, and that is right around sunset, a little bit before and a little bit after sunset. The lighting is gorgeous and very flattering and warm in color. Magic hour could also be around sunrise, but it's a little harder to shoot at sunrise too. But right when the sun is low in the sky is magic hour, and cinematographers love it, and directors, I'm sure actors and actresses, because they look so good also. And Cimino also wanted it to be very realistic. And so he made sure that everybody had the right kind of Stetson cowboy hats and the right kind of boots, and that the cowboy boots, and that the railroads, if they were narrow gauge, that it had to be narrow gauge railroads and things like that. And a lot of this authenticity just doesn't show up on the screen. But he really felt that it had to have this level of authenticity, and also only shooting for a few hours a day, which is going to lengthen the shoot. And studios fall into this sort of a trap. Psychologists and economists talk about throwing good money after bad. And so once you have spent lots of millions of dollars, in today's dollars, if we adjust for inflation, it would probably be well north of $100 million, maybe even north of $200 million. And the director says, look at this wonderful stuff that we've shot. Isn't it beautiful? And we're a little over budget, a little bit behind schedule, and please, we need some more money in order to finish the film. And so the studio is going to say, okay, we're almost there. Sure, here's a little bit more money. And that is throwing good money after bad. If the whole movie's over budget, economists and psychologists say you should just pull the plug and not waste any more money. But that's not really human nature. It's really hard for us to do that. We want to keep putting money into that car that doesn't work very well, or keep putting money into that house that seems to be falling apart day by day, and so on. It's really human nature, and Cimino fell prey to that, and the studio, and they kept giving him more money and kept giving him more money, and he kept asking for more money, and he was so far away, way up there in Montana. It was really hard for them to check in on him. And the press got word of this, and they started reporting about problems on the set, problems in Montana, problems at Heaven's Gate, and all of that. And instead of talking about how possibly wonderful the movie was and how gorgeous it looked and all that sort of thing, the press started reporting very specifically about how much the movie cost. And that had already always been a thing. They talked about how much money Gone with the Wind cost, and how much money Cleopatra cost back in the early 1960s was also a very big deal. Cleopatra nearly drove 20th Century Fox bankrupt. And so now here we are just about 20 years later, and it seems to be happening again. And the studio is a falling prey, right? Didn't really learn their lesson, didn't learn history, didn't learn their lesson. And the press is kind of having a field day over all the cost and the overruns and all that. So the auteur director and the studios are going to start taking back control of the filmmaking process. We're kind of at the end of this golden age for directors in particular, and it began back when we started talking about Bonnie and Clyde and Easy Rider and The Graduate and movies like that, and all the way through, and so many wonderful movies that came through in this era that we've talked about for the last couple of classes. But the studio, there are too many flops, too many big budget flops, because a lot of these directors have made their wonderful work of art, and now they want to do a follow-up, and they have rather enlarged egos, and sadly, a lot of them have developed drug habits. Cocaine, for the most part, makes you feel all up and ready to take on the world and all that sort of thing. A number of these directors start divorcing their first wives and marrying the younger, prettier actress or model, the trophy wife, and that sort of thing. And they're all young, and everybody's telling them how great they are. And they fall prey to that whole situation. So let's take a look at some of these big directors, and these are major directors: Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, Robert Altman. Look at all these wonderful directors, and they all start turning out bombs, very expensive movies. There's Steven Spielberg right there on a miniature, shooting miniatures for his film 1941, which, by the way, I think is a pretty good movie. It's a comedy, and Spielberg has vowed never to make another comedy again because of this awful experience. But I think it's pretty funny. But it's a case of giant costs. You know, wouldn't it be funny, just like in the silent days or the slapstick days or the 1930s, if a can of paint falls on somebody's head? Well, sure, or a pie in the face, right? Slapstick stuff, very funny. So Spielberg has to up it by 10 or by 100, and now we have a tank driving through a paint factory, okay? Because that'll be a lot funnier than one can of paint falling on somebody's head. Now we have a tank or a Jeep, it's a tank, I think, driving through a paint factory. Okay, so 1941 is set the days after December 7th, 1941, in Southern California, in Hollywood, and people were rightfully very, very nervous that Hawaii had just been attacked by the Japanese, bombed by the Japanese, and possibly they were going to keep on coming, right? They would keep on coming, and California's next. And so there was a lot of reaction and overreaction and all that. So Spielberg takes all this and turns it into a comedy. He takes the hottest comedy stars of the era, a lot of people from Saturday Night Live, like John Belushi and Bill Murray, and people like not Bill Murray, sorry, John Belushi, and people like that, and making it really, really big. And comedies don't really need to be $200 million movies, really. Comedy is, you got some jokes and maybe some sight gags and stuff like that. But he's making it into a big, giant, expensive, like an action movie, like a superhero movie. And so, 1941, Spielberg's big bomb. Martin Scorsese makes a musical, of all things, with Robert De Niro playing a jazz musician, and Liza Minnelli. William Friedkin follows up The Exorcist with Sorcerer, and Exorcist was a big, big hit, and he had won the Oscar and lots of awards for The French Connection just prior to that, so he was on a real roll. And so people that saw The Exorcist are thinking, from the director of The Exorcist comes Sorcerer. Well, what's Sorcerer about? Well, not sorcerers, it's about truck drivers. Okay, and the Sorcerer is the name of one of the trucks, and it's based on a pretty good French film from the late 1950s, I think it is, called Wages of Fear, which is a really good movie, and it takes place in South America, and they are paid money to transport dynamite over the mountains, over the Andes Mountains. So, it's ready for thrills and things like that, and rope bridges and suspense and tension and all that kind of stuff. But don't call your movie Sorcerer, because people are going to think they're going to get more of The Exorcist. Anyway, a big, big budget movie. Didn't need to be nearly as big a budget movie as it was, and somehow with that really ill-advised title, not a good idea. Francis Coppola follows up all of his wonderful movies, Godfather, Godfather Part 2, Apocalypse Now, with another musical, One from the Heart, a musical set in Las Vegas, and it's kind of experimental. He does some stuff with video, very early with video and things like that, builds a whole strip of Las Vegas, and so on. I don't know what it is with these directors and musicals. They went to film school, they studied musicals, they loved American in Paris and all those great musicals, and so they decide that they want to, now that they're the king of the mountain, that they want to make musicals. Robert Altman from MASH makes Popeye the musical. Popeye the musical. You can't believe it. It's true. Popeye the musical with Robin Williams. Robin Williams is not a singer. And they build a giant set in Malta, which is an island in the Mediterranean, because that's like Popeye's little, I don't know, his fishing village, something like that. A big, expensive, stupid movie, really, hate to say it. And Peter Bogdanovich, who had also made some The Last Picture Show, some really wonderful early movies in this period, and he makes a musical too. They All Laughed, with his girlfriend starring in the role, Sybil Shepherd. She is not a singer. She's beautiful, a former model, turned out to be a pretty good actress over the years, and probably not quite a very good actress really for They All Laugh, but he decides he wants to make a musical, and Burt Reynolds, who's not really a singer. So all these directors, they all start churning out these big bombs, and the studios start taking back control over these movies, and they don't all come out like in one year. They're spread out over a period of 4 or 5 years, something like that. But this is indicative of the problems going on in Hollywood after this wonderful film school generation made these wonderful movies. So, sticking with Spielberg for a little while, this is when he really came to the forefront. We have Jaws from 1975, and it's based on a book. And I probably don't need to tell you a lot of movies and movie franchises are based on books. Whether it's the James Bond movies, which used to be based on books, they ran out of books after about 13 or so. Harry Potter books, Lord of the Rings books, Twilight books, and Hunger Games books. Lots and lots of movies are based on books, and the plus side of that is you have a built-in audience. All the people that read the book are probably going to want to see the film. Who are they going to get to play Katniss, and who are they going to get to play Harry, and all that kind of thing. So there's a kind of a built-in audience. Usually it's a pretty good idea. Comics are kind of like that. Marvel and DC and all that kind of stuff are kind of like that. But books are a little bit different. And usually a much bigger audience than for comic books until more recently. So Jaws, about a shark attacking people near an island. The island is Amity, and it's a fictitious island on the east coast there somewhere near near Long Island or somewhere around in there, Connecticut, New York, around in there. And I love this picture because there's this mechanical shark, and you can't really train sharks, so and maybe you can get some actual sharks in the wild, but you can't get them attacking people and things like that. You can get them just swimming, but you can't really do that with sharks. So they decide they're going to have to build a mechanical one. And this is before CGI, of course, 1975. This is a good 25 years, 30 years before they could get really good CGI to do this kind of stuff. And they build it in California in a freshwater tank, and now they're out on the ocean, which is saltwater. Apparently that was part of the problem as well, but the shark just didn't really work very well. And it would just lock up or seize up or whatever, and the actors would be sitting around in their trailers or playing cards or whatever, and they'd hear on the walkie-talkies, "The shark is working, the shark is working. Everyone to the set, everyone to the set." So, just as it says, the editor, Verna Fields, and by the way, I have to insert here, a lot of top Hollywood editors are females. They are having a hard time breaking into the directing branch, and but as editors, and they're also having a hard time breaking into cinematography too. I don't know why it's such a boys' club with cinematography and with directing. Hollywood, like society at large, does have certain places where they would be, women's jobs, makeup, hair, set design, things like that. Those would be deemed women's jobs on a set. But the guys' jobs, carrying those heavy lights and carrying those cameras and tripods and all that kind of stuff, that is deemed men's work. There's no reason that should be the way it is. Women are just as capable of men as doing all this kind of stuff, as men of doing all this stuff. But women, for various reasons, going all the way back to the silent era, have had pretty good luck in the editing side of things. And so, like I say, going back from the silent era up to the present, a lot of directors, Quentin Tarantino, Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, have often worked with female editors. So that is a place where they seem to be doing pretty well. But still a lot of work to be done in directing and some of the other branches. So anyway, Verna cut most of the shark out of the movie, and Spielberg was there, sort of deciding. And film is 24 frames per second. Mostly now it's digital, but and they have ways of approximating frames to digital. But back then it would be literally film, and so they're cutting the shark practically frame by frame. 1 second is 24 frames, so they're putting in 8 frames, 10 frames, 12 frames, 16 frames, just quick cuts of the shark. And I've been telling students for a long time that they just about cut the shark out of the movie, and a couple years ago I thought maybe I should check this out and let's get some numbers on this. And I put the DVD in and started my stopwatch, and came up with about 2 minutes and 20 some seconds, 22 maybe seconds of screen time for the shark. So it's a 2-hour movie about a shark, and the shark is in the movie about 2 minutes and 22 seconds. We don't even see the shark for the first hour of the film, and not much other than that. So I've linked to some pretty good stuff there with Jaws. There's the very first attack, no shark whatsoever. It's during a party, young people on a beach having a bonfire and drinking and all that sort of thing, and a girl and a guy decide to go for a dip. That's the first attack, no shark whatsoever. And it's horrific. It's totally horrific, right? Because we see the girl, young lady, woman. I hate to call a 20-year-old a girl, but we see the woman there treading water, and all of a sudden she gasps and gets pulled under, and she's screaming and all that. It's really scary and shocking. And no shark whatsoever. And then we have the second attack on the beach near the 4th of July weekend, and it's crowded, full of people, lots of people in the water, and our central character is the new sheriff or police chief in town. And he's from a city. I think he's from Philadelphia, and he's sort of taken this job. It's supposed to be kind of an easy job. And he's very, very nervous. He doesn't really even like the water very much. And it's a wonderful scene. And there's some nice stuff that Spielberg does. So I want to kind of walk you through it, and then I want you to stop this part and go and watch the shark attack, and then come back to this. That's what I'd be doing in class. I didn't really want to do it like I probably could have done something like that. But these are going to get posted to YouTube, and I wanted them to be just kind of all together, about an hour or so all together. So I didn't want to chop them all up too much. But you can do that quite easily. Just, hit the pause and go to the next one and then come back. Anyway, what you will see is that Spielberg's going to put the camera pretty low to the ground, and that is how the audience is going to see it, those of us in the audience. So it's almost like our feet are in the sand or our feet are in the water. So we're going to feel real low. He's not going to give us any high angles so that we can sort of get a bird's eye view of this attack. He's going to introduce us to the two victims, Pippet the dog and Alex the boy. And we're going to meet them very quickly and very briefly. You have to meet your victims in a horror movie or slasher movie or thriller movie. You got to meet your victims, even briefly. And we're also going to see lots of yellow sprinkled out throughout the beach scene with blankets and hats and picnic baskets and inflatable rafts, all this stuff. Lots of yellow around. Yellow's kind of a up color. It's a active color, a very high energy color. So Spielberg's going to have lots of yellow throughout that scene. Also, our our police chief is going to be watching the movie and or watching the ocean, and that's kind of us, right? He's the outsider from the island, and we are kind of outsiders from the island. We're the audience, and we're going to kind of see the movie through his eyes. And people keep walking in front of him, and that means walking in front of the camera or in front of the camera lens. So our view is going to keep getting blocked, and that creates a little bit of tension. What we can't see, right? That's if you can't see something, it's like the dark, right? What's under the bed, or what's in the closet, or what's in the forest, right? What's out there lurking in the what that we can't see, and what we can't see is always going to be very, very scary. Now this is a bright sunny day, but we're still going to have our view blocked by people keep walking in front of the camera on purpose, of course. A number of them is going to be yellow. It almost like Spielberg told a couple of people wearing a yellow raincoat walk in front of the camera. It's kind of close and blurry and out of focus, but we're going to get that. And then we are going to get a false alarm. So we got to have a false alarm. That's really a good thing in horror movies. It's a real trope. The false alarm. A girl's going to scream, and our sheriff, our police chief, he's gonna sit up and look out, and oh my God, what's going on? And it's just a girl and a guy playing out in the water. He's got her on his shoulders, and he's walking around with her on his shoulders. So we get that scream. And then what's going to happen is John Williams and his wonderful music, dun 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 dun, dun. He's going to get that wonderful bass line of music, and basically the camera. We're not going to see the shark. We're going to have a camera, and we're going to see through the shark's eyes. So POV, point of view, and we're going to get the point of view of the shark. And we already saw a shark POV in the very first opening scene with the young lady out in the water, Chrissy, out in the water. So we already know that when we get that POV shot, we're seeing through the shark's eyes. So the music and the POV, and we have the shark. And we are not going to see the shark again in this scene. We're going to see a bit of a fin, but it's not that whole big shark, mechanical shark thing. So first to attacks, no shark whatsoever, and it's going to be quite shocking. Poor little Alex. We're going to the POV, and then the camera basically is going to swim up to Alex's feet, kicking the water on the inflatable yellow raft there. Maybe the shark thinks it's a seal or something like that, and he's looking for dinner. And then we're going to have panic and so on the beach, and everybody's going to come into the beach. And one woman, Alex's mother, is it's just heartbreaking to see her. Everybody else has gotten their loved ones, their children, and all that. And then Spielberg's going to show the water lapping on the beach, and it's going to be red, right? Blood red. And so a couple of things. I've seen this so many times. There's a couple of things that I can't help but notice. One of them is Alex. He can't even be 100 pounds. He's just this skinny little 10-year-old, something like that. There's no way that him being attacked 50 yards out in the water, that the blood is going to wash up ashore. But that's okay. That's okay. It's kind of poetry there, right? It's the sort of thing that you get to do, right? It doesn't have to make any sense, but you can do that, and it does work for Spielberg. The other thing is the depth of the ocean keeps changing. The young boy and the girl, he's standing on the bottom with her on his shoulders, so the water isn't very deep. Even 40 or 50 yards out, it's not much deeper than waist deep. But then we're going to see through the shark's eyes that the ocean is suddenly at 20 or 25 feet deep, so that the shark can swim around and all that. And that's okay. That's okay, right? We're not going to overthink this. That's what you do when you're making a film. So Spielberg, he wanted to shoot on the actual ocean. The people at the studio said, we can build you a whole big ocean tank at the studio. You can have control over the lighting. If you need to shoot around sunset, we can control the lighting, and we can make our own waves and all that. And Spielberg said, no, 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 it's going to look fake. It's got to be on the real ocean. So he insisted that they move the whole crew out to the ocean, and the big mechanical thing out there as well. And it was just a real nightmare for poor Stephen. But like I said, he's a good filmmaker, and all of his instincts were really true and right on from where to put the camera and blocking the view and John Williams, all that stuff, right? He really made lemonade out of these lemons. He wasn't dealt a very good hand, and he really did this amazing movie, and it's incredibly tense. Now today we have CGI, and we could have the shark waking up and making a cup of coffee, and you can do anything with CGI. We don't have to fill in any gaps. I always pair the shark with the alien from Alien, because the alien in Alien is only on screen about 2 minutes or so, even a little bit less. So Ridley Scott had to do lots of fast cutting and things like that, just like Spielberg did. They're both very smart filmmakers. Now today they could have the alien and the shark, and they could be doing anything with CGI. And our imaginations are really the best filmmakers, right? Are our imaginations. We can imagine things much scarier and more horrific in our own mind's eye. And I think in large part that's what made the movie so fantastic. Okay, so we talked about the art of Jaws, but really the main reason that we're talking about Jaws is the business side of things. So the studio was very nervous, and normally movies, this is the original, I think this is on the book cover, and one of the original posters is just wonderful. Normally movies in this era, the big movies would be released in the fall, in the winter, or maybe in the spring, but big movies didn't tend to come out in the summer. Summer was drive-in movie time, cheap, whatever. They weren't all black and white by the mid-70s, but they weren't the big important Oscar movies in the summertime. But the movie is the book and the movie is set in the summer, and the studio thought it would be a good time to release the movie sometime in June or July, I think it was. And they started getting very nervous about the shark, the mechanical shark, and it just not working very well. So they decide they are going to do a wide release. Hundreds of theaters, well, maybe 100 theaters. Today it would be thousands of theaters. It's a big movie, like a Star Wars movie or a Marvel movie, could be maybe 4,000 screens. And of course, we have to remember that a lot of theaters have multiple screens. Back in the 1970s, usually it was one theater with one screen, and each theater held a lot more people, hundreds, if not 1,000 seats. Now we have much smaller theaters, multiplexes, all that kind of stuff. 20, 30 screens under one roof. So it gets a little complicated. Normally they talk about screens versus theaters. Anyway, movies would be limited, or what they call limited or a platform release. Big cities, New York, LA, Chicago, something like that. And then hopefully the word would get out that it's a good movie, and the press would have screenings, and the press would have critics would see it, and it would get reviewed, and they could do lots of marketing and all that kind of stuff, building word for the movie. And that's how most of the big movies went back then. Right? All the big movies, Godfather, all those kinds of movies, that's how they went. But the studio is, Universal is thinking, oh my God, we've got a turkey on our hands. We will advertise the heck out of this thing, and we'll advertise on TV, which normally you wouldn't do if it's only playing in a couple of theaters. But they have a big national ad campaign, newspapers, magazines, billboards, all that. And they will, and it's kind of cynical, I have to say. It's kind of cynical. We need to get as many people in to see this movie on the opening weekend before everybody finds out that it's a turkey, basically, right? And this is the way movies have been ever since. Okay, ever since Jaws, the whole emphasis is on the opening weekend. Okay, opening weekend, wide summer releases. A lot of the biggest movies come out in the summer, although summer has sort of expanded to late April and May in many instances. And for some reason, August isn't really part of summer. Summer for the movie business is May through July, basically, even though school doesn't really get out until June for a lot of high school kids and so on and so on. But anyway, summer, May through July, big movies, wide releases. You know all the movies I'm talking about, whether it's a Fast and Furious movie or a Marvel movie or a James Bond movie or whatever. A lot of them come out in the summer, and the other big time is around Christmas time. And Christmas time, Christmas vacation, all that kind of thing. That would be the other time when the big movies, Star Wars movies, have been coming out at Christmas time, and other movies, James Bond movies, have been coming out in the fall. So summer and fall, and wide releases. And all those lessons were learned from Jaws, right? All those lessons were learned from Jaws, wide release, get everybody in on opening weekend. Half the time you don't know if the movie's any good or not. Thanks to social media, word can get out pretty fast. So speaking of social media, sometimes if it's got really good word of mouth, then attendance will really jump from Friday night to Saturday night, even within the opening weekend. And if the movie is getting poor word of mouth, then attendance will stay flat. Normally it goes from Friday to Saturday. It goes up. More people go on Saturday than Friday. But if it's got poor word of mouth, thanks to the really fast social media that's out there, then the movie might even drop attendance from Friday to Saturday or remain flat. But anyway, opening weekend, still a big thing. And on Sunday afternoon, most news feeds will have the top 10 box office from the previous weekend. They can estimate from Friday and Saturday, and they have their formulas, and they can usually figure out what the Sunday box office is going to be. Usually it's a little bit of an estimate. And sometimes they revise those. Sometimes it's like a tie, and one movie looks like it's going to beat another movie out, and then after the true figures come in on Monday. But anyway, that opening weekend, it's a big thing, and we see that all in our news feeds and the press and the papers and all of that. Star Wars, 1977. George Lucas, another one of the film school guys, and this film is going to take all of the lessons learned from Jaws and increase all those. Jaws did pretty well with T-shirts and things like that, and the soundtrack, and a few things like that. And Star Wars is just going to take all that, action figures and soundtracks and all that, and that is how they're going to make lots and lots of money, right? Not just from the box office. That's the whole point. There are other ways to make money from a film than just paid attendance at the box office. And Lucas, pretty cagey guy, even when he was a young guy in his 20s, he sold the rights to Star Wars, and kept the all the licensing and the rights and everything to the toys. He's actually made more money off of the toys and things, the merchandise, than the studio made off of the film, and that allowed George Lucas to self-fund the rest of his portion of the Star Wars movies, the next 5 Star Wars movies. He could fund those, produce them, fund them, and only use the studio for marketing purposes. The studios are still pretty important when it comes to marketing, distribution, getting the film out there, booking it into theaters, booking the stars onto the talk shows to promote the movie on the Today Show or on the Tonight Show, whatever. And the studio's still really good at that. The studio's really good. But, filmmakers know the art, and they know the lights and the cameras and the editing and all that kind of stuff. But the whole marketing thing is still done by the studios. So Lucas doesn't market the movies, but he had been able to self-finance all those movies ever since. So diving deep into the business side of all of that, and that is that's the Disney. You probably could figure that out. That's the Disney corporate headquarters in Burbank, D23. That actually references, if you've heard of that, that references 1923, when Walt Disney incorporated the company. And there are the 7 Dwarves. And so revenue streams become a big thing. Going back again, it had been around for a while. If there was a musical, especially something like The Sound of Music, which was a big hit, then the soundtrack album was going to sell a lot. But normally there wouldn't be much else after the soundtrack album for musicals, Grease, movies like that, Saturday Night Fever. Then that would be it. And Disney in particular, but a lot of the other companies, they figured out pretty fast, video games, toys, books, all that stuff that they got from George Lucas, making those little Star Wars toys and everything. There's a lot of money in that. Really more money in some cases than the film itself. Now, a little bit of a side point on Star Wars and the toys. Star Wars came out in May of 1977, and believe it or not, there weren't enough toys on the shelves for that Christmas. Whatever that is, 6 months later. 6 months later, they need a much longer lead time for the toys, making them in Korea or Taiwan or China or somewhere like that. And nobody figured it was going to be such a huge hit. Lots of little kids got sort of like an IOU or a little card saying this entitles you to a Luke Skywalker, whatever, action figure, whenever we get them made. Okay, and so they learned that lesson too. That never happened again, but they probably lost out on quite a few toy sales. If the toy store shelves had been full that December, they probably would have sold more. But it still worked out okay, and kids got toys eventually. And the studios started seeing that these revenue streams, here comes a stream of soundtrack albums and another stream of later on video games, toys, books, lunch boxes, all that, right? All that. All those streams are going to pour into the river. And that giant river of Star Wars, Marvel, whatever, Fast and Furious, James Bond, Harry Potter, all those different ways of making money. And the studios are going to start to become kind of valuable property. They had a long period of decline from when we talked about earlier, the fall of the studio system, going back to the late 40s, this long, slow, steady decline. It didn't look like they were worth much of anything. All they did was they made movies and put them in theaters, and that was it. And if you can't make money off of the movie in the theater, then that's it. Then the movie's not doing any good anymore. And over the years, they start seeing that movies can be shown on television again, so they can start selling them to television. Then cable comes along, then VHS comes along, and then DVDs come along, and streaming comes along, and they see that all these wonderful films, Gone with the Wind, and Casablanca, all that stuff, and Snow White, their lives are not over. Their lives are not over. They can come back and come back and come back and generate more money and more money and more money. But it used to be once the movie was out of theaters, then it would just go in storage, and that would be that. Nobody would think that a movie could generate any more money. But over the years, like I say, with TV, cable TV, home video, basically the whole the umbrella term is home video, DVD, streaming, cable, and a lot of money to be made. So these studios start to be valuable properties. They start getting gobbled up by bigger and bigger conglomerates. Now, in the 1970s, Disney was pretty much at a low ebb. They were not the hot company in the 1970s or the 1980s, but they got some very aggressive management in the 1980s and 1990s, and they started turning out more and more valuable types of movies. They went real big for musicals in the 80s and 90s with Aladdin and The Lion King and Beauty and the Beast and The Little Mermaid, all that, right? So they sort of got this nice rebound. But today, Disney is the big company by a long shot. They are the big company by a long shot, and as you may or may not have heard, they have swallowed up Lucasfilm with all the Star Wars movies. They've swallowed up Marvel with most of the Marvel stuff except for Spider-Man, and they have swallowed up the Muppets, Pixar. They've swallowed up a lot of stuff. So consolidation by the studios. Now other studios have been part of that as well, but Disney is really the example. Disney is by far the big example. And so, lesson learned, importance of opening weekend. If the second weekend drops more than 50%, that is not a good sign. And some of these big movies open up to $100 million on the opening weekend at the box office, or even more. We're talking about the Star Wars movies, the James Bond, Fast and Furious, Marvel, all that stuff. They cost $250 to $300 million to make, and opening weekend, it might make $100 million. Second weekend, $50 million. Third weekend, 25, 12 and a half, etc., 6, half. But if a movie opens up at $100 million and on the second weekend it makes maybe $30 million, okay, much less than half, much less than 50%, then word is getting out that this is not a really good movie. And there have been some big budget flops, John Carter and some movies like that. They open up big, Hulk, actually, some other movies like that. They open up real big, and then they drop more than 50% on the second weekend. So that is a problem. Oh, that seems to be backwards. Okay. Second weekend drop, and there we go. Multiples, how much a movie makes from its opening weekend as a total of its entire theatrical run. And like I said, a lot of movies make half of their total box office on the opening weekend. $100 million. Okay, then half that, 50, then half of that, 25, and so on. And so half on the opening weekend and the other half on the next 5 weekends, and then that's it. And then it's gone, right? That's kind of the way the business runs. That's the way the business runs. big upfront, big opening weekend, and half, 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 half for about a month or so, and then it's pretty much done. Platforms is the business term for how you put your product out there. Okay, think of it like that. Do you put it out in a theater? Do you put it out on TV? Do you put it out in a game? Do you put it out on the internet? Okay, or streaming. So those are called platforms. Those are called platforms. Okay, there we are at the new Star Wars land at Disneyland. What is it? Galaxy's Edge, I think it's called. Synergy is the term that Disney has been so successful having all parts of its theme parks working together, or of its corporations working together. So the theme parks are going to help out the movie studio, the TV studio is going to help out, the radio network's going to help out, cruise lines, streaming, they're all going to help promote the same product. Okay, what we see on the screen and the characters parading through Disneyland. Franchise, we've talked about this, I believe, back with James Bond movies, and a franchise is a film that can generate sequels. Okay, and that's a business term. McDonald's are franchises, and basically you just put your money up. Okay, McDonald's helps you find the location, they take care of all the recipes, they take care of all the advertising and the workflow and all that, and it's kind of guaranteed to make money for the investors, the franchisers. And so that term has migrated to films, right? Some of these films are like a franchise, guaranteed to make money. Every Star Wars movie, Marvel movie, Pixar movie, not Pixar, Pixar's aren't franchise, but Wizarding World, Harry Potter type movies, right? They are all franchises going back to James Bond or thereabouts. Back end is profit sharing with the actors, getting some money on the back end, not up front, not up front. Here's your salary, okay, but sharing in the profits, and that's getting a piece of the back end. And if you are a big actor, if you are a Leo or a Brad or a Sandra or a Meryl, okay, you probably are going to get profit sharing. And by the way, in the Marvel world, Robert Downey Jr. was the only one that got a piece of the back end. None of the Chris's did, or anybody else, but Robert Downey Jr. was the only one that was part of the profit sharing in all of that. Reboot is starting all over, pretending that all that earlier stuff didn't even exist. Okay, this is the James Bond. He looks like Daniel Craig. He doesn't look like Sean Connery. This is Batman. This is Spider-Man, Superman. Okay, they have all been rebooted, and it is a weird feeling when your favorite franchise is rebooted. At some point, the studios are going to take your favorite intellectual property. There will be a new Star-Lord. There will be a new Iron Man. It won't be Robert Downey Jr. It'll be a new Iron Man. Might even be a female or a person of color, and it's going to be kind of weird because you grew up on Robert Downey Jr., you grew up on Chris Evans, Chris Hemsworth, Chris Pine, Chris Pratt. Those are the ones that you know, the four holy Chris's. And here's this new person. And for somebody older like me, or possibly your parents or grandparents, I grew up on Sean Connery as James Bond. And then here comes another Bond and another and another. So it will happen. It feels kind of weird. I would say my insight, if there is insight in all this, is your first love, okay, your first one when you are young, when you're a teenager and in your 20s, and that's the stuff that's going to really imprint itself on you for the rest of your life. So the music that you listen to as a teenager or 20-something, the actors that play the heroes in your movies, and so on, are going to have a real strong impact on you. And you know, I grew up, I loved classic rock, Beatles, Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, all that stuff made a strong impact on me. I listen to music today, I listen to the modern stuff, but you know, the stuff that you first fall in love with back when you're a teenager, that's the stuff. James Bond, Sean Connery, and so on. So at some point in 20 or 30 years, you'll be an old fart just like me saying, "Who's this new Iron Man? Who's this new Potter?" That's not the one that I grew up on, right? You get to be an old codger like me, bemoaning that whoever's playing the new whatever isn't quite right. 70% of Hollywood film revenue comes from overseas. I love this poster. I have no idea what language this is. And I always ask my students, because I usually have foreign nationals in my class, Chinese, Korean, whatever, Vietnamese. I usually have students, but no one has ever been able to tell me what this is. So I have no idea what this language is. Maybe it's Korean. I don't know. I thought Korean was a little bit more boxy like this as opposed to Chinese. So maybe it's Korean. Maybe I just haven't had any Korean students in my class. I don't know. Anyway, 70% of Hollywood revenue comes from overseas. That is a big deal. And movies, that means only 30% comes from the US. So movies are big movies, big expensive movies, not little comedies and stuff, but the big action movies, the franchise movies are going to be geared to a world audience, not geared specifically to an American audience. We're still the biggest part of the world. We're almost equaled by China. We'll see how that works out, but so much of it comes from overseas. And by the way, and I think I mentioned this with James Bond, China is such a big audience, and Russia's a pretty good sized audience, and so on, that they probably won't be bad guys in like James Bond movies or Fast and Furious movies or Jason Bourne movies or whatever. It's easy to have a bad guy who's a business person, businessman, businesswoman, a drug dealer or something like that. But I think gone are the days of the James Bond movies when the Russians or the Chinese were the bad guys. I don't think we're going to see that anymore. Action movies are the easiest to market to foreign audiences. You probably could have figured that out. You know, chasing and fighting. I have to say that most foreign films in the U.S. are subtitled. Most foreign films in the U.S. are subtitled. They're smaller films. Even the movie that won the Best Picture, Parasite, was subtitled. But all of the big movies, all of the Star Wars movies, and all of the James Bond movies and Fast and Furious movies, they are all dubbed. They are all dubbed. Foreign audiences don't read subtitles. They have actors. They match the voices with Brad or Leo or Chris, and they do a pretty darn good job of it in most cases, and you almost would swear that it was made in your own language. And my experience with that is my wife is Thai. We met in Thailand. I got married in Thailand and visit Thailand, and we saw King Kong a few years ago, the Peter Jackson movie. I had already seen it here in the U.S., and we went over around Christmas, New Year's, and the English language version wasn't going to be showing for a while, so we said, what the heck, let's just see it in Thai. And the dubbing was amazing. The Naomi Watts character, the girl, it's almost like Naomi Watts learned how to speak Thai. It sounded just like Naomi Watts. It was really something. Whoever the Thai person that they got to do Jack Black wasn't quite there, but definitely Naomi Watts. Studios have fought TV, they fought home video, they fought streaming, big music companies have fought files and file sharing and all that kind of stuff. They really aren't at the head of new technology and so on. They're kind of following rather than leading. Um, so that's history, right? We could learn from history, new technology. I can't say that movie studios would still be shooting black and white silent like they did with Charlie Chaplin days, but every time a new technology comes out, it is disruptive. Sound was disruptive. They had to put speakers and everything in all the theaters. Color was disruptive. It cost a lot more money to process color film and so on. VHS was disruptive and so on. So it's they fight all of these new developments hand over fist. So moving off from Steven Spielberg and Jaws, let's stick with Spielberg here for a little while longer. And I want to mention that he began in television. Yes, he began in television, directed some television movies. They called them made-for-TV movies. He had an internship when he was in college. He was at Cal State Long Beach for a little while. He didn't graduate from there until just a few years ago, actually. And after his internship was over, apparently he just kept showing up at the studio, and the guard at the gate recognized him, and he got to go in and found an empty office and set up shop. And pretty amazing story. He's told the story. It's not a secret. And over the years, he has had this very enviable ability to do big budget popcorn movies. And popcorn movies sell lots of popcorn. And the kinds of movies that sell lots of popcorn are action movies. And certainly big budget movies for sure. So they have kind of this generic term, popcorn movies. And there are some of Spielberg's big popcorn movies, Close Encounters, Indiana Jones, a bunch of those, and Jurassic Park, a couple of those. And he has managed to not quite one for them and one for me, as he calls it. Other directors call it that too. They one for the studios and then one personal film for themselves. But Spielberg making personal films for himself, more or less, those are the movies that are going to win the Oscars, like Schindler's List, about the Holocaust, Saving Private Ryan, which actually was a pretty good-sized hit. Lincoln, Bridge of Spies, Color Purple, Amistad, movies like that. And that's a pretty enviable career. I have linked to Saving Private Ryan. The opening sequence is just amazing. It's the landing of the Allied forces on the beaches of Normandy in northern France, and it's just an amazing piece of filmmaking. It really is. It's justifiably famous, and I think most of it, luckily on YouTube, most of it is there. While you're looking at it, I'd like you to notice a couple of things. It is not quite in black and white, but Spielberg and his editors have drained most of the color. They've taken a lot of the saturation. They've drained most of the color out, so it kind of looks like a World War II era, almost like a black and white movie. It's not exactly black and white, but almost. At the very beginning, we are going to get a framing device, and we're going to have an old man walking through a cemetery with his family, and as becomes apparent, then we see an American flag, and then we see a French flag, and we figure out, where he is. And when he sees the grave marker, he's going to break down and be down on his knees and sobbing, and we're never going to see who is buried there. And that is our mystery, and that's what framing devices do often. They set up kind of a mystery to pull the audience in. Gee, I wonder who's buried there. We can't even tell who the old guy is. It's not Tom Hanks or Matt Damon or anybody like that in old age makeup. So we really don't know who the guy is that's there. And we're going to come in on his eyes, and we're going to kind of see what he's thinking about. His mind is going to go racing back to D-Day. But importantly, we are not going to cut to another pair of eyes. And if we cut from an old man's eyes to a young guy's eyes, then that's the same guy. That's how it works. That's kind of the rule. If you cut to an old guy and a young guy close up on their eyes, then that's who that is. But Spielberg doesn't do that. He cuts to the ocean and waves and boats and things like that, and then we come in on Tom Hanks's craft. So really a wonderful scene. Enjoy it, and then come back. And we're going to transition to Vietnam War films. There's Stanley Kubrick working on Full Metal Jacket in suburban London. Yes, he's there in suburban London. So the war, for the most part, it was a little bit before 60, but for the most part, we started ramping up our troops. 1965, Lyndon Johnson, and we're pretty much out by 73, and most of these movies are going to be in the late 70s and 80s. So they are not done during the war itself. It is one of those things where you kind of need to step back and get a little bit of a perspective over all of that. None were filmed in Vietnam. We are going to get a little bit of realism versus expressionism. Okay. So, realistic type movies, you can do that in a documentary. Okay, but these movies are going to exaggerate in order to make a point. There are some great documentaries. Ken Burns has made a really wonderful documentary on the Vietnam War, but these are going to be a little out there, a little darker, satirical. In Apocalypse Now, there's going to be surfing. And during a battle. So that's kind of the difference. The World War II movies are going to be much more, oftentimes more patriotic, more straightforward, heroes, villains, all that. And when we go off to Vietnam, because the war was also divisive, it wasn't quite as unanimous as World War II was. Lots and lots of people, the day after the bombing at Pearl Harbor, there were lines around the block at recruiting stations and things of young men volunteering to go serve. But with Vietnam, people were trying to avoid the draft. They were staying in college and getting student deferments and all sorts of other things. So just like the wars, the films that were made about those wars reflect those realities. Okay, so like I say, struggle with authority in the Vietnam War movies. When Francis Coppola was shooting Apocalypse Now, most of the people he talked to said it was a nightmare, and so he made it kind of like a nightmare, kind of dreamlike and almost like a nightmare. So Full Metal Jacket, very interesting. They found a cement factory that was going to be torn down for housing, and got the use of it, and they brought in bulldozers and things and knocked over some walls, and then they brought in some palm trees and things like that, and they put up some stuff in Vietnamese and in French, since it was a French colony for so long. Part of the Vietnam War was shot or took place in cities during the Tet Offensive of 1968 in Hue in particular, and in Saigon. There was a lot of fighting in cities, house to house, street to street, the sort of thing that we think of in World War II, working their way through various French and Belgian cities and things like that. And so Kubrick shot Full Metal Jacket just outside of London. Got a couple of nice links there. We start off in basic training, and about the first chunk of the movie, maybe 20-30% of the movie takes place in basic training, and then off to Vietnam we go. and watch those segments and enjoy them. It's a great movie. You might choose to watch it. One of the drill sergeant, he does a great job, and he and Kubrick worked very closely together. The drill sergeant was a real drill sergeant, Lee Ermey, and he came up with 8 pages of taunts and threats to new troops. And he and Kubrick they transcribed it all and got it all down and worked it down. And one of the troop members, he's gonna call him Private Pyle, and that's a reference to this guy who was on TV, Gomer Pyle, USMC, and he was sort of a hillbilly kind of a guy. So that's Private Pyle. So Apocalypse Now, 1979. This is much more expressionistic, not particularly realistic. Francis Coppola. I've got a couple of clips relating to a air attack, cavalry, the air cav, as they called it, and they would blow the reveille and off they would go. But in this movie, they're going to be playing music, the Ride of the Valkyries, out of some large speakers underneath this helicopter. I don't know that has ever happened. Helicopters are very, very loud. I have no way of knowing, but I highly doubt that anybody could hear music played from a helicopter in another helicopter. But it's in the movie. It's kind of cool, and we're going to get some wonderful battles there from Apocalypse Now. And there are some scenes with Marlon Brando. We know Brando going back to The Wild One and The Godfather, and he is in this film as well. So Apocalypse Now, enjoy that. Coppola coming off a pretty good decade there with Godfather Part 1, Part 2, and Apocalypse Now. So Vietnam War films mostly are done years after the war, the actual war, somewhere 65 to 73. And here we see Deer Hunter, Coming Home, Go Tell the Spartans, Platoon, Good Morning Vietnam. They were all done years after the war. Apocalypse Now and Star Wars are examples of the new emphasis on sound design in movies. There is some wonderful sound mixing there. Is Ben Burt, a legendary sound designer, and he is mixing the air cav attack on the beach there from Apocalypse Now. There are the helicopters coming ashore, and Lucas developed his THX sound system for theaters because he didn't think the sound was good enough for his Star Wars movies. So that's an important part of what is going on at that point. Spike Lee, an African-American director, and often themes of race and being black in America. There he is from last year with his Oscar win. Always a very flashy dresser. I love the way Spike dresses. He looks fantastic. Do the Right Thing, School Days, Jungle Fever, Malcolm X, Chirac. So Do the Right Thing, that's the film that put him on the map. And I have the trailer for Do the Right Thing from back in the 80s. And his latest film, Black Klansman, and those 3 Ks there are on purpose, and that is where he got his first directing and Best Picture Oscar nominations. And our last director of the day, kind of a long day. You've been able to pause and stop and take breaks, I know, but Martin Scorsese, definitely from the film school generation. He went to NYU. He actually taught there for a while. He often has themes of, or his films take place in New York, often in the gangster underworld. Not always. Raging Bull isn't in the gangster underworld, but a lot of his movies, including his latest, The Irishman, and the one where he finally won his coveted Best Director Oscar, are all set in the underworld. Casino in Las Vegas. Um, the Departed is the one where he finally got his coveted Best Directing Oscar. These are the films with Robert De Niro. Great stuff from Goodfellas. That's probably still really his best film. That's the one where he really got robbed. He really should have won his Oscar for Goodfellas. But over the years, when we talk about perspective, time has been very kind to Goodfellas and to Scorsese, right? Sometimes we talk about standing the test of time, and Goodfellas has definitely stood the test of time. Some great scenes from that, a wonderful tracking shot, some wonderful Steadicam stuff in Goodfellas. It's a good way to put the audience kind of in the movie. It's sort of like we're trailing along with Ray Liotta's character taking his date through the back door and through the kitchen of the nightclub and getting seated right up front. And it's like we are there too. We're going to get some first-person voiceover. Ever since I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster. He's going to open with Casino, again, set in Las Vegas. And The Irishman, I think he and De Niro had been apart for 20-some years, and then they finally came back together. The Leo movies, and that's where Scorsese finally won his Best Picture and Directing Oscars a few years ago there with The Departed. We get Matt Damon and Leonardo DiCaprio in The Departed. Leo in The Aviator and Gangs of New York as well, and Shutter Island. Not in Hugo, though, or Silence, but those are some of the Leo films, and I have linked to some scenes for The Wolf of Wall Street. It's not exactly a gangster movie, but these New York stockbrokers and traders practically are mafia types. They have parties, they have drugs, they have prostitutes, they have flashy clothes and big cars. So I don't know, maybe Scorsese's telling us that these guys are the new mafia. I don't know, but it's a really fun movie, very funny, way over the top, and we're going to see Leo breaking the fourth wall, talking to the camera, and voiceover, and very much a first-person experience, just like Ray Liotta in Goodfellas, actually. A lot of fun, and he seems to be enjoying all of these drugs. He has a long list of the drugs that he's going to do, and you know, cocaine and whatever, and quaaludes and marijuana and booze, and oh my God, such a long list of drugs, and he seems to be having a pretty good time of it. And those of us in the audience, we kind of have to think to ourselves that this is kind of a mixed message, right? Is he telling us that drugs are fun and good, and his big mistake was getting caught? Or is he telling us that he should never have been doing the drugs in the first place, because this is a 3-hour movie, and for about the first 2 hours and 45 minutes, he seems to be having a heck of a lot of fun with all of his drugs and the way he treats women and all of that, right? It's really a mixed message. What is he trying to tell us? And we get that mixed message in Goodfellas as well. What is the message? Hollywood, sadly, does that sort of thing. They show us lots of bad behavior, maybe Scarface, Al Pacino, lots of bad behavior, and then at the very, very tail end of the movie, they get their just desserts. They either get killed in a hail of gunfire or off to prison. Leo goes off to prison. We never see him in prison or anything like that, and then he comes out and he's advising the FBI. So if we leave the movie after 2 hours and 45 minutes, it looks like Leo wins and goes out on top. Scorsese and his frequent collaborators, De Niro with 11 now, and Leo with 6, and his editor, Dear Thelma, at 19 and counting. So a lot of the big collaborators for a number of our directors, whether it's Tim Burton, yes, he's worked quite a bit with Johnny Depp, but he has worked far more with Danny Elfman, his main composer. So I don't know what Scorsese has coming up next. He's very active. He's probably got something in the works. I'll have to check. So there we go. Cine 104, History of Motion Pictures, Class 9. A lot of business, but business is a big part of the business. Okay, I love the art. I love Scorsese and Spielberg and how he does the shark and all that kind of stuff, and how Scorsese does the tracking camera and everything. But the business side of things and release patterns and opening weekends and revenue streams are also very, very important to this whole discussion. So make sure you get all that down in your notes. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time.